Dad, it is time for you to move out. Sunny Pines has an open bed. The words hit the air like a lead weight, completely shattering the quiet hum of the Sunday morning. I stopped wiping the counter. My hand hovered over the polished granite, a surface I had installed myself 3 decades ago. I looked across the kitchen island. There sat my 44-year-old son, Bradley, casually chewing on a piece of bacon. He did not even look up from his phone when he delivered the eviction notice. Next to him, his wife Megan took a slow, deliberate sip from her coffee. It was a mug I had bought for her last Christmas. Over the rim of the ceramic cup, she was smirking. A cold, calculating smirk that told me everything I needed to know. They had planned this. They had sat in the dark and plotted how to throw a 78-year-old man out of his own home. But what they did not know was that I was not the helpless, clueless old man they thought I was. By Wednesday, they would not just lose me. They would lose the very roof over their heads. They would lose everything they thought they had stolen from me. But before I tell you how I systematically dismantled their perfect little lives, let me know where you are watching this video from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that respect is earned and betrayal should never go unpunished. Now let me take you back to that kitchen, to the exact moment my own flesh and blood decided I was just an expiration date. I stood there, the dish towel damp in my hands. The kitchen was flooded with the warm Texas morning light. This was not just a house. This was a monument to a lifetime of sweat calluses and broken fingernails. 40 years ago, when the Austin real estate market was nothing but dirt and empty fields, my late wife Sarah and I bought this plot of land. I was a general contractor. I poured the foundation myself. I framed the walls. I laid every single oak floorboard in this house so that my family would have a fortress. Sarah loved this kitchen. I built the custom cabinets exactly to her height. I sanded the wood until my hands bled, just to see her smile when she ran her fingers over the finish. Sarah and I used to sit on the floor of this very room eating takeout pizza from a cardboard box, imagining the sound of our children running down the halls. I built this house to be a sanctuary, a place of love, of warmth, of family. And now here was Bradley, a middle management paper pusher who could not even change a flat tire, sitting in the heart of my life's work, telling me it was time to leave. "I think it is for the best," Dad, Bradley added, finally setting his phone face down on the island. He adopted that fake, patronizing tone people use when talking to toddlers or the terminally ill. "You've been getting a little forgetful lately. Last week you left the porch light on all night. It is becoming a safety hazard. We just want you to be safe." Richard Megan chimed in, leaning forward. Her designer bracelets clinked against the granite. "Sunny Pines is a beautiful facility. They have round-the-clock care. You will be around people your own age. You will not have to worry about maintaining this big old house anymore." Safety. The word echoed in my mind, dripping with absolute hypocrisy. I was a retired contractor. My mind was sharper than a surgical blade. Just 3 years ago, I spent 2 weeks completely rewiring the electrical system of this house to modern codes. I installed a smart home security system. I replaced the old gas stove with an induction cooktop that automatically shuts off, specifically, so there would never be a fire hazard. Forgetful. I remembered exactly how they ended up sitting at my island. 4 years ago, Bradley showed up on my porch in the pouring rain. He had been downsized from his corporate job. They had been evicted from their luxury apartment downtown. Megan was crying, her mascara running down her face, swearing they just needed 6 months to save up for a down payment on a new place. They were drowning in car payments and drowning in a lifestyle they could not afford to maintain. I opened my doors to them. I gave them the entire second floor. I paid for the groceries. I paid the utility bills. I let them live rent-free so they could get back on their feet. But as the months turned into years, the gratitude vanished. 6 months turned into a year turned into 4. The tears dried up, replaced by an arrogant sense of entitlement. They took over the living room. They filled the driveway with a leased luxury car they still could not afford. They started hosting lavish dinner parties for their superficial friends, politely asking me to stay in my room so I would not embarrass them with my old flannel shirts and work boots. They did not want me safe. They wanted me gone. They wanted to play rich hosts in a $1 million home without the inconvenience of the old man who built it. The sheer audacity of it burned a hole in my chest. A weaker man might have cried. A more impulsive man might have grabbed the cast-iron skillet and chased them out into the street. But I am not weak, and I am certainly not impulsive. In my line of work, you do not tear down a wall until you know exactly where the load-bearing beams are. You assess the structure. You plan the demolition. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my hands to tremble just a little bit, letting the dish towel slip from my grip and fall onto the counter. I looked down at my worn-out slippers playing the role they had written for me perfectly. "Maybe you are right," I whispered, my voice sounding frail and defeated. "The house is getting a bit too much for me. I just need some time to think about it." The relief that washed over their faces was instantaneous. Bradley exhaled loudly, a triumphant grin breaking through his fake concern. Megan actually clapped her hands together, a short, sharp sound of victory. "Of course, Dad," Bradley said, standing up and patting my shoulder, as if he had just won a difficult negotiation. "Take the weekend. But we really need an answer by Monday so we can secure the bed." They turned back to their breakfast, their mission accomplished. I turned around and began to walk slowly toward the hallway. I dragged my feet, selling the illusion of a broken man. But as I passed the entryway table, my eyes locked onto Megan's expensive leather purse. It was sitting open carelessly, tossed onto the mahogany console. Sticking out of the side pocket was a thick manila envelope. The corner of the document was visible, bearing the seal of a local notary public, and a few words printed in bold black ink. Words that made the blood freeze in my veins. I did not stop. I did not stare. I kept shuffling down the hallway toward my bedroom. But the frail old man act was over the second I closed my bedroom door. The war had just begun. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floorboards, letting the anger settle into a cold, hard focus. A few minutes later, a soft knock echoed against the wood of my door. It was Bradley. He pushed the door open without waiting for an answer, stepping into my private sanctuary with a false look of sympathy plastered across his face. In his hand, he held a cheap, glossy brochure. He walked over and laid it gently on my nightstand. It read, "Sunny Pines Nursing Home," in bright, cheerful letters. He sat next to me, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Dad." "I know this is a lot to take in," he said softly. "But you have to understand, Megan and I are just worried about you. You have been getting so forgetful lately. Last week you left the stove on. You forgot to lock the front door twice. It is just becoming too dangerous for you to be alone in this big house when we are at work. We love you too much to let something terrible happen to you." I looked at the brochure and then at my son. The lie was so smooth, so well rehearsed, that I almost admired his absolute audacity. Forgetful. Dangerous. I mentally mocked every single word that came out of his mouth. I am a retired general contractor. My mind is sharper than a steel trap. I still do advanced structural calculus in my head just to keep my brain active and healthy. As for the stove, I replaced the old gas unit with an induction cooktop 3 years ago. It has an automatic shut-off feature that engages the exact second a pot is removed from the burner. It is physically impossible to leave it on and start a fire in the kitchen. And the front door, I personally installed a smart lock system that automatically engages after 60 seconds. He did not know that, of course. He never paid attention to the house unless something was broken, and he needed me to fix it for him. The truth had nothing to do with my safety or my memory. It had everything to do with their aesthetic and their pride. 4 years ago, they came to me completely broke, drowning in debt, and begging for a roof over their heads. I took them in without a second thought because he was my son. But now my presence was an inconvenience to their lifestyle. They wanted to play the role of rich, sophisticated hosts to their new circle of wealthy Austin friends. An old man in flannel shirts and scuffed work boots walking through the living room ruined the illusion of their perfect self-made success. They wanted the million-dollar home without the man who actually built it. They wanted to erase me from the picture entirely. I forced my hands to shake. I reached out and picked up the brochure, letting my fingers tremble against the cheap paper. I looked at Bradley with wide, frightened eyes, perfectly playing the part of the helpless senior citizen they so desperately needed me to be. "Is it nice there?" I asked, keeping my voice small and wavering to sell the performance. "It is wonderful, huh?" Bradley smiled clearly, relieved that I was not putting up a fight or arguing with him. "They have a beautiful garden. They have a piano in the common room. You will make so many friends your own age. Just look over the brochure today. We can talk more about the transition tonight when we get home." He patted my knee, stood up, and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him. The moment the latch clicked into place, my trembling hands went perfectly still. I tossed the insulting brochure directly into the trash can beside my desk. I did not need a nursing home. I needed a battle plan. I waited in my room until I heard the heavy thud of the garage door closing. They were finally leaving for work. I walked over to the bedroom window and watched their leased luxury car back out of the driveway and disappear down the suburban street. The house fell into a deep, hollow silence. Now it was my turn to work. If they were planning to put me away and take over my home, I needed to make sure all my legal documents were secure and untouchable. I needed to find my property deed immediately. The original deed was locked safely in a deposit box at the downtown bank, but I kept a certified copy in my old study at the end of the hall. I needed to review the exact wording of the title to ensure there were no hidden loopholes Bradley could try to exploit with a shady lawyer. I stepped out of my bedroom and walked down the long sunlit hallway. The floorboards creaked under my weight, a familiar sound I had known for over 40 years. I reached the end of the hall and placed my hand on the brass doorknob of my study. It was a room where I had drafted hundreds of blueprints, where I had taught Bradley how to manage his first allowance, and where I kept the records of my entire life's work. It was my private space, a room Megan rarely ever entered because she claimed it smelled too much like old paper and cedar wood. I turned the knob, expecting the heavy oak door to swing open easily. It did not move. I frowned and tried again, putting my weight into my shoulder and pushing against the wood. The door was completely locked, but it was not just locked. As I leaned closer to inspect the hardware, I realized the old standard doorknob had been completely removed. In its place was a heavy-duty, high-security deadbolt. My own study, the room containing all of my most private, financial, and personal documents, had been sealed off from me. I stood there in the quiet hallway, staring at the shiny new brass lock, and a cold realization washed over me. I had come looking for a simple piece of paper, but I had just found something much more shocking. This was no longer just an eviction. This was a hostile takeover. They had invaded my personal sanctuary, a place filled with memories of Sarah and my hardest working years. The audacity to change a lock inside my own home, a home I built with my bare hands, ignited a fire inside me that had not burned this hot in decades. I traced my fingers over the cold metal of the new deadbolt. They thought they could simply lock me out of my own life. They thought I would just pack my bags, hand over the keys, and quietly fade away into a sterile nursing home room. They were gravely mistaken. I slowly pulled my hand away from the door and smiled. It was a dark, humorless smile. Bradley had forgotten one very important detail about the father he was trying to discard. A lock is only an obstacle if you do not know how to take it apart. And I knew exactly where I kept my heavy-duty tools. I stood there, my hand resting on the cold brass of the new deadbolt. This study was the nerve center of my life. The oak desk inside held my tax returns, banking ledgers, and the certified copy of the property deed. It was the one room that still belonged entirely to me. Now I was locked out. A floorboard creaked behind me. "Richard, what are you doing?" I turned. Megan stood at the end of the hallway wearing a silk robe and holding a steaming cup of herbal tea. Her eyes darted from my hand to the new lock. A brief flicker of panic crossed her expression, quickly masked by that same patronizing smile. She glided down the hallway, her bare feet padding softly against the oak floor. I let my shoulders drop, slipping back into the character of the confused old man. I pointed a trembling finger at the door. "I was just trying to get some old tax papers," I said, keeping my voice hesitant. "But the knob does not seem to want to turn. Did the lock break?" Megan let out a theatrical sigh, placing her free hand gently on my forearm. Her touch felt like ice. "Oh, Richard, I am so sorry. I turned this room into my private yoga studio. I really needed a Zen space to meditate. You know how stressful things have been for Bradley and me lately. A yoga studio." The lie was so utterly ridiculous, it took every ounce of my willpower not to laugh. Megan did not do yoga. Her idea of decompressing was maxing out a credit card at a boutique. Furthermore, the study was the worst possible room for a studio. It faced the afternoon sun, directly turning into an oven by 3 p.m., and my massive mahogany desk dominated the floor space. "But what about my papers?" I asked, widening my eyes to look distressed. "My ledgers? The filing cabinets?" "Oh, do not worry about that," she said breezily, taking a sip of her tea. "I had Bradley pack those dusty old boxes and move them down to the basement. You do not really need to worry about all that complicated financial stuff anymore. You should be relaxing. We have everything handled." Handled. That word echoed ominously in my mind. Her lie about the basement was the fatal flaw in her story. The basement was notoriously damp. When Sarah was alive, we never stored anything down there because the mildew would ruin it in weeks. Megan knew this. She claimed she saw a spider down there 3 years ago and refused to set foot on the stairs ever since. There was absolutely no way she hauled heavy boxes of files down to a damp cellar. My papers were still in that room, and she was guarding them. I nodded slowly, looking down at the floor as if I were too tired to argue. "I understand, Megan. A Zen space sounds nice. I will just go rest in my room." She patted my arm, her smile widening into a triumphant grin. "Good idea, Richard. Rest up. Bradley and I are going out tonight. We have a dinner party with some investors from his firm. We will be out quite late, so do not wait up for us. I left some soup in the fridge for your dinner." She turned and walked away. I watched her go, the anger in my chest hardening into an unbreakable resolve. Investors from his firm. Another lie. Bradley was a mid-level manager who had just been demoted. They were going to a country club, trying to impress people who did not care about them, plotting to steal the ground beneath my feet. I went back to my bedroom and sat in the worn armchair by the window. I listened to the sounds of the house. I heard the shower running upstairs and the muffled sounds of them arguing over what to wear. I waited with the patience of a hunter. Time moved slowly, but every tick of the clock was another second closer to the truth. Finally, at 7 p.m., I heard them coming down the stairs. The heavy front door opened and closed. The electronic hum of their leased luxury car vibrated through the driveway. I watched through the blinds as the vehicle backed out and sped off down the street, disappearing into the evening shadows. The house was finally empty. The silence that settled over the rooms was no longer hollow. It was charged with anticipation. I stood up. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. My posture straightened and my shoulders pulled back. I was no longer the frail old man waiting for his soup. I was Richard Caldwell, the man who built this house from the dirt up. I headed straight for the mudroom at the back of the house. I reached into the bottom cabinet and pulled out my old steel toolbox. It was battered, scratched, and covered in dried paint from decades of hard labor. The weight of it in my hand felt like an old friend. I carried the heavy steel box down the hallway, my boots thudding softly against the oak floorboards. I stopped in front of the study. The shiny new brass deadbolt gleamed in the dim hallway light, silently mocking me. Megan thought a cheap lock could keep me away from my own life. She thought a simple locked door was enough to hide their secrets. I set the heavy toolbox down. The metal clanked against the wood, a decisive sound that echoed through the empty house. I unlatched the lid, revealing rows of specialized lock-picking tools I had acquired over 40 years in the construction business. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy-duty tension wrench and a precision pick. I looked at the locked door. They wanted to play games with my life. Now it was my turn to see exactly what they were hiding behind this door. I selected a heavy-duty tension wrench and a standard hook pick from the velvet-lined tray inside my toolbox. My hands moved with a familiar practiced rhythm. 40 years of installing doors, fixing jammed mechanisms, and building houses from the ground up had left permanent knowledge in my bones. I slid the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying just a feather-light amount of rotational pressure. Then I inserted the pick, gently lifting each brass pin inside the cylinder. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I counted them off in my head, feeling the microscopic clicks vibrate through the metal tools and into my fingertips. Megan had probably thought a heavy-duty label on the plastic packaging meant it was impenetrable. But a cheap deadbolt from a discount hardware store is nothing more than an illusion of security against a man who knows how it was manufactured. Exactly 45 seconds after I knelt down, the final pin set into place. The cylinder turned with a heavy, satisfying thud. I withdrew my tools, stood up, and pushed the heavy oak door open. The hinges groaned softly, a sound I had not heard in months. I stepped across the threshold, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the closed wooden blinds. I reached out and flicked the wall switch. The brass desk lamp flickered to life, casting a warm yellow glow across the room. I stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, simply taking in the sheer disrespect laid bare before me. There was no yoga mat on the floor. There were no meditation cushions, no incense burners, no signs of a peaceful Zen sanctuary whatsoever. Instead, my private study looked like the aftermath of a desperate burglary. The room was in complete chaos. My beautiful mahogany desk, a piece of furniture I had salvaged and restored by hand decades ago, was covered in a mountain of scattered documents, empty coffee mugs, and crumpled-up legal pads. But the sight that truly made my stomach turn was located in the far corner of the room. My twin steel filing cabinets had been dragged away from the wall. The heavy metal drawers were hanging open at crooked angles. Someone had taken a pry bar or a heavy flathead screwdriver to the built-in locks. The steel was gouged, bent, and violently forced open, exposing 40 years of my meticulously organized life. My tax returns, my old building permits, Sarah's medical records, and my retirement account statements were pulled from their folders and carelessly thrown across the floor like worthless trash. A wave of bitter, suffocating betrayal washed over me. I walked slowly into the room, my boots crunching over a scattered pile of old bank statements. I stopped in the center of the study, remembering a rainy Tuesday evening over 30 years ago. In this very room, at that very desk, I had pulled up a wooden chair for a 12-year-old Bradley. He had been so proud of his first lawn mowing money. I had bought him a little green ledger and sat patiently beside him for 2 hours, teaching him how to balance a checkbook. I had explained to him the value of a hard-earned dollar, the importance of keeping his financial word, and the necessity of honest labor. I remembered the way he had looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes soaking in every word like gospel. I had believed with every fiber of my being that I was raising a man of integrity. Now, looking at the violently pried metal of my filing cabinets, that memory felt like a cruel, sick joke. The boy who had meticulously recorded his $5 lawn mowing earnings had grown into a man who would crowbar his own father's private files while he sat in the next room, waiting for a bowl of leftover soup. It was not just an invasion of privacy. It was a complete and utter desecration of every single value I had ever tried to instill in him. They had not just searched this room. They had ransacked it with a frantic, greedy desperation. I forced myself to breathe evenly, pushing the emotional ache down and replacing it with the cold, calculating mindset of a contractor assessing a severely damaged foundation. I walked over to the mahogany desk and looked down at the chaotic spread of papers. They were searching for something specific. You do not destroy 2 heavy steel filing cabinets unless you are hunting for a very particular hidden document. I began to carefully sift through the mess on the desktop, moving aside the crumpled legal pads and old coffee rings. Beneath a stack of irrelevant utility bills, a familiar heavy stock paper caught my eye. I pulled it free. It was the deed to the property, or rather my certified copy of the property deed. My heart skipped a beat, then immediately settled as I recognized the watermark. Thank God my lawyer Thomas had advised me to keep the original sealed in a secure bank vault downtown years ago. But the fact that Bradley had dug out the copy meant they were actively researching the legal boundaries of my ownership. I placed the deed down and continued to search the immediate area. Next to the keyboard of an old laptop they had left plugged in, I noticed a thick stack of freshly printed emails. The paper was still crisp. I picked up the stack and adjusted my reading glasses. The emails were sent from Bradley's personal account, not his work email. I looked at the recipient address. It was a representative from a company called Apex Horizon Financial. I recognized the name immediately from my years in the real estate business. They were not a traditional bank. They were a predatory lending company, notorious for offering high-interest, aggressive cash loans against property assets. My eyes scanned the printed text, jumping from one paragraph to another. The words blurred before my vision sharpened with adrenaline. The representative from Apex Horizon Financial was walking Bradley through securing a massive loan. You do not get that size loan without collateral. Bradley had absolutely zero assets. The luxury car belonged to a dealership. Megan's clothes were bought on credit. The only valuable asset was the house I was standing in. I read a highlighted paragraph midway down the second page. The officer wrote they could not proceed with property leveraging unless Bradley was the primary title holder or possessed full legal authority over the current owner. My stomach clenched as their scheme took a terrifying shape. They were not just trying to put me in a home. They were trying to use my property as a giant ATM to fund their delusions. I dropped the emails onto the desk and opened the remaining drawers. I needed to see exactly how far my son was willing to go. I pulled open the bottom right drawer. It was full of heavy legal folders. I grabbed the top folder and flipped it open under the desk lamp. Inside was a single document. The bold heading at the top read, "Durable Power of Attorney." My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, picking out key phrases that felt like physical blows. It granted Bradley complete control over all of my financial assets, real estate holdings, banking accounts, and investment portfolios. But it did not stop there. The second section shifted into medical territory. It gave him the absolute right to make all healthcare decisions on my behalf, including the authority to place me in a long-term care facility against my will and the power to dictate my end-of-life care. This was not just a financial theft. This was the complete erasure of my autonomy. They were drafting the paperwork to strip me of my voice, my freedom, and my rights. I flipped to the last page, my breath catching in my throat. There on the bottom line was my signature, Richard Caldwell. I stared at the ink. The cursive loops were a sloppy imitation of my handwriting. Bradley clearly tried to copy my signature from an old card. He pressed too hard on the paper, making the ink pool at the end of the letters. Next to the forged signature was a bright blue notary stamp, complete with a signature from someone I had never met. It was a fake stamp easily ordered online by anyone with a card. The forgery was sloppy, the work of a desperate amateur. But I knew enough about the modern legal system to understand how dangerous this piece of paper truly was. If Bradley walked into a busy bank branch or a predatory lending office with this document, a careless clerk might just process the request. Once the wheels of a massive financial transaction started turning, it would take me years of expensive legal battles to prove the fraud and unravel the damage. I could not let this see the light of day. But I could not destroy it either. It was the proof of their betrayal. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My hands were steady now, stabilized by a cold, calculating rage. I opened the camera application and made sure the flash was off. I held the phone over the forged document, tapping the screen to focus on the fake signature and the fraudulent notary stamp. I took 3 high-resolution photos of the final page. Then I flipped back to the front, photographing every single paragraph of the power of attorney. I moved on to the printed emails, capturing the dates, the sender addresses, and the discussions about leveraging my home. I was building an ironclad case brick by brick. I reviewed the photos in my digital gallery, zooming in to make sure every word was perfectly legible. The evidence was secured. I placed the phone back into my pocket and reached out to close the legal folder. I needed to put everything back exactly as I had found it. But before my fingers could brush the cardboard cover, a low rumble vibrated through the floorboards. It was the heavy hum of the garage door opening. My heart slammed against my ribs. They were back. The fancy dinner party must have ended early, or they had lied about the evening. It did not matter. They were pulling into the garage right now. I had less than 30 seconds before they walked through the mudroom door. I moved with a speed and agility I did not know my 78-year-old body possessed. I shoved the folder back into the bottom drawer and slammed it shut. I roughly swept the scattered bank statements and emails back into the chaotic pile they had created on the desktop. I grabbed my tools from the desk and shoved them deep into my pockets. I turned off the desk lamp, plunging the study back into darkness. I stepped out into the hallway, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. I pulled the tension wrench and the hook pick from my pocket. My hands were moving entirely on muscle memory now. I slid the tools into the new brass deadbolt. I could hear the thud of car doors slamming in the garage. I heard the lock on the mudroom door click open. I worked the pins inside the cylinder frantically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The mechanism caught. I turned the tension wrench, locking the deadbolt firmly into place. I pulled my tools out just as I heard Megan complain loudly about her shoes. I slipped the picks into my pockets and silently hurried down the hallway toward my bedroom. I stepped inside and eased my door shut, leaving it open just a crack. A second later, the hallway light clicked on. Footsteps echoed heavily on the floors. I stood in the dark, my chest heaving silently, clutching the phone in my pocket. The rest of the long, agonizing night passed in a blur of sleepless anticipation. I laid awake and listened to the muffled sounds of Bradley and Megan moving around the house, their voices unaware of the storm gathering right beneath their feet. When morning finally broke, painting the Texas sky in shades of pale orange, I already had my script prepared. I walked into the kitchen at 7:30, intentionally dragging my feet. Bradley was pouring his coffee. Megan was scrolling through her phone, not even bothering to look up. I cleared my throat, making my voice sound weak and raspy. I told them my joints were aching, and I had scheduled a last-minute appointment with Dr. Higgins downtown. Bradley barely glanced in my direction, tossing me a dismissive nod and telling me to take a taxi so I would not get lost. I agreed meekly, turning away to hide the fire burning in my eyes. The moment my hired car rounded the corner and out of their sight, I gave the driver a different address. We were not going to a medical clinic. We were heading straight to the downtown law offices of Thomas Sterling. Thomas and I had known each other personally for over 40 years. Long before he wore custom-tailored suits and sat behind a mahogany desk, he was a scrappy young legal clerk who helped me navigate my commercial construction contracts. We had built our careers side by side in the dusty heat of Austin. He was the godfather to my late wife's rose garden, and a man who possessed the legal ferocity of a starved wolf. If there was anyone I trusted to help me navigate this betrayal, it was him. I walked into his downtown office without an appointment. His secretary, who had known me for a decade, took one look at the grim determination on my face and immediately waved me through the double oak doors. Thomas looked up from a stack of legal briefs. His stern, wrinkled face broke into a warm smile that faded the exact instant he saw my expression. I sat down in the leather chair opposite him. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I pulled out my phone, unlocked the screen, opened the photo gallery, and slid the device across the polished wood of his desk. Thomas picked it up, adjusting his silver-rimmed reading glasses. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the screen. I watched as the warm, welcoming demeanor of an old friend completely vanished, suddenly replaced by the cold, razor-sharp focus of a veteran attorney. He swiped to the next photo, then the next. The silence in the executive office became heavy, broken only by the hum of the city traffic 14 floors below. When he finally reached the image of the forged signature and the fake notary stamp, the vein in his temple throbbed. He placed the phone gently back onto the polished desk, slowly removed his glasses, and let out a very long, slow breath. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously quiet and laced with venom. "This is a Class 3 felony, Richard. It is textbook fraud, elder abuse, and a direct conspiracy to commit grand larceny. I can have a police cruiser sitting in your driveway in 15 minutes. We can have Bradley wearing handcuffs before his lunch break. Let me make the call." He reached for the telephone resting on his desk. I leaned forward and placed my hand firmly over his wrist, stopping his movement. "No, Thomas," I said, my voice steady and void of the weakness I had faked all morning. "Do not call the police. Not yet." Thomas looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion and rising anger. "Richard, he is trying to strip you of your legal autonomy. He is trying to steal $1 million property and lock you in a state-run facility against your will. You simply cannot protect him from this terrible consequence. He crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed by an apology." "I am not protecting him," I replied, staring directly into the eyes of my oldest friend. "Jail is entirely too easy for what he has deliberately done. If he goes to jail right now, he gets a public defender. He cries to a judge about making a mistake, and Megan plays the weeping victim. They will paint me as a confused old man who misunderstood their intentions. No. I want to take away the one thing they truly love in this world. I want to take away their money, their status, and their arrogance. I want to dismantle their life the exact same way they tried to dismantle mine." Thomas slowly pulled his hand away from the receiver of the telephone. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, dark understanding dawning in his eyes. He knew me well enough to recognize the tone of a man who was preparing to demolish a building down to its foundation. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his tone shifting from protective friend to strategic partner. I pointed to the phone on the desk. "You saw the emails from Apex Horizon Financial. Bradley is trying to leverage the house for a massive cash loan. But a man does not commit a brazen felony just to upgrade his lifestyle. There is a desperate panic hidden in that forgery. They need a massive amount of cash, and they need it immediately. I need to know why. I need you to run a quiet, deep background check on their finances. I want to see every single hidden bank account, every maxed-out credit card, and every unpaid debt they have been hiding from me. Find out exactly why they need my house so desperately today." Thomas nodded, turning to his monitors. His fingers began flying across the keyboard. "Give me until this afternoon, Richard," he promised. "I will find their breaking point." I left Thomas and spent the next few hours sitting on a wooden bench in a nearby public park. I watched the city of Austin move rapidly around me, completely oblivious to the silent storm raging inside my chest. The afternoon sun beat down heavily on the paved walkways, but I felt nothing but a cold, heavy numbness. At exactly 2 o'clock, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. It was a brief text message from Thomas. It contained only 2 simple words. "Come back." I stood up slowly, smoothed the wrinkles from my jacket, and made the short walk back to his tall glass building. When I stepped into his private executive office for the second time that day, the atmosphere was entirely different. The window blinds were drawn tightly against the glaring Texas sun, casting long shadows across the room. His mahogany desk was completely covered in freshly printed financial spreadsheets, banking summaries, and detailed credit reports. Thomas was rubbing his temples with both hands, looking exactly like an exhausted man who had just sifted through the terrifying wreckage of a train derailment. He silently gestured for me to sit down in the leather chair. I took my seat and mentally braced myself for the incoming impact. Thomas leaned forward, folding his hands tightly over a thick stack of printed papers. "Richard," he began softly, his voice heavy with absolute disbelief. "I knew your son was living far beyond his actual means, but the harsh reality of his financial situation is significantly worse than either of us could have ever imagined." He slid a single crisp sheet of white paper across the smooth mahogany desk. It was a consolidated debt summary. I looked closely at the bold black number printed at the very bottom of the page: $140,000. I blinked twice entirely, sure my aging eyes were playing cruel tricks on me in the dim light. $140,000 in unsecured credit card debt. This astronomical figure did not include the leased luxury car currently sitting in my driveway, and it certainly did not include their regular daily living expenses. This was pure consumer debt. It was a terrifying mountain of financial ruin built entirely on high-interest plastic cards and arrogant, foolish delusions. "How is this even remotely possible?" I asked, my voice barely a strained whisper in the quiet room. "They live in my house completely rent-free. I pay the annual property taxes out of my own pocket. I pay all the utility bills every single month." "Where did all of this money go?" Thomas began, flipping quickly through the stacked pages, laying out the sordid details of their hidden, desperate life. "Megan has a severe shopping addiction," he explained grimly, tapping a manicured finger aggressively against a lengthy credit card statement. "She has been treating high-end luxury boutiques like ordinary grocery stores. She is dropping thousands of dollars every single month on designer clothes, imported luxury handbags, and incredibly expensive boutique salon treatments. She even opened 3 secret credit accounts in her maiden name just to keep the invisible money flowing. But her spending habit is only half of this terrible disaster." Thomas pulled another official document from the messy pile. It was a confidential employment verification record. Bradley was demoted at his corporate firm over 8 months ago. He permanently lost his senior management title, and along with it, he lost nearly 40% of his annual salary. Instead of adjusting their lavish lifestyle or simply telling you the honest truth, they stubbornly doubled down. They used high-interest credit cards to cover the massive financial gap, pretending everything was fine, while they drowned in an inescapable sea of compounding interest and late fees. I sat back deep into the leather chair, feeling a sickening mixture of utter disgust and profound sorrow. I thought about the sheer volume of sweat, blood, and immense personal sacrifice it took to build a truly stable life. When Sarah and I bought that empty dirt lot in Austin 40 long years ago, we did not have a single extra penny to spare. We lived on cheap canned beans and plain white rice for 2 solid years just to save money. I drove a battered pickup truck with a rusted-out floorboard because every single extra dollar went straight into buying structural lumber-heavy nails and pouring concrete. I saved copper pennies in a glass jar on the kitchen counter just so I could afford to take Sarah out for a nice dinner on our wedding anniversary. I physically bled into the dark soil of that property to ensure my family would never have to know the cold grip of poverty. Today, that very same plot of land is worth well over $1 million entirely because of decades of brutal, unglamorous, relentless discipline. And now my own flesh and blood son was actively trying to steal my entire life's work simply to pay for his wife's shallow vanity and his own pathetic, shameful cowardice. He simply could not face the harsh reality of his own professional failure, so he actively decided to sacrifice my peaceful future just to hide his own massive mistakes. They are completely broke, Thomas stated flatly. The credit card companies are preparing to file lawsuits. They are desperate animals backed into a dangerous corner. But this is where the story goes from a tragic financial failure to a calculated criminal conspiracy. Thomas grabbed a different folder and pulled out a complex application. Do you remember the printed emails you found from Apex Horizon Financial? He asked quietly. I nodded slowly. Thomas pointed his pen directly at the third paragraph. The forged power of attorney is not just about medical decisions. Look right here. I leaned in and read the tiny print. The breath caught painfully in my throat. The forged document was the exact key they needed to unlock a massive financial scheme. Thomas tapped the application form with the heavy gold barrel of his pen. They are applying for a reverse mortgage, Richard. He explained, his tone laced with a mixture of professional disgust and personal outrage. I stared at him, letting the words sink into my mind. A reverse mortgage. It is a financial product specifically designed for senior citizens, allowing them to convert part of the equity in their homes into cash. But Bradley is not trying to secure your comfort in your twilight years. He is using that forged power of attorney to bypass your consent entirely. The moment you are securely locked away in that cheap nursing home facility declared legally incompetent by the very paperwork he falsified, he plans to execute this massive loan against your property. He slid a detailed amortization schedule across the desk so I could see the terrifying mathematics for myself. Your house is easily worth $1.2 million in the current Austin real estate market. Thomas continued, pointing at the top line of the spreadsheet. Apex Horizon Financial is perfectly willing to offer a lump sum cash out of $600,000. Bradley and Megan plan to take that cash, completely wipe out their $140,000 of credit card debt, and simply pocket the remaining $460,000. They want to use the equity you built with your own bare hands to fund their luxurious lifestyle. They want to take expensive vacations, buy new designer wardrobes, and continue to host those lavish dinner parties as if they were brilliant self-made millionaires. I looked at the paperwork, a cold sickness settling in the pit of my stomach as the final piece of their treacherous puzzle snapped firmly into place. And what happens to the house, I asked, though I already knew the devastating answer. Thomas leaned back in his large leather chair and sighed heavily, rubbing a hand across his tired face. The bank ultimately takes it, he replied quietly, emphasizing the brutal reality of their scheme. Because Bradley has absolutely no intention of ever repaying a single dime of this massive loan. He cannot afford to. The interest will rapidly compound month after month, quietly eating away at the remaining equity of the property while you are sitting alone in a sterile room at Sunny Pines. When you eventually pass away, or when the loan balance inevitably exceeds the total value of the home, Apex Horizon Financial will initiate a full legal foreclosure. They will seize the property, evict anyone living there, and sell it to the highest bidder to recoup their losses. Bradley and Megan will simply walk away with $500,000 in stolen cash, leaving your entire life legacy to be auctioned off by a predatory lender. They are treating your home like a disposable lottery ticket, discarding you the moment they secure their unearned jackpot. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their master plan echoed loudly through the quiet executive office. I closed my eyes and took a very long, deep breath. For the past 24 hours, a profound, agonizing heartbreak had been tearing my chest apart. I had been grieving the loss of my family, mourning the terrible realization that my son had fundamentally betrayed my unconditional trust. But sitting there, staring at the exact dollar amount he had placed on my personal freedom and my hard-earned legacy, that paralyzing heartbreak completely evaporated into thin air. It was instantly replaced by a cold, hard, and terrifyingly calm resolve. The man currently sleeping under my roof, eating the food I bought with my own money, and driving a luxury car while plotting my ultimate demise, was not the little boy I had patiently taught to balance a checkbook. That innocent boy was dead and buried. The man sitting in my kitchen was nothing more than a dangerous, greedy parasite who had attached himself to my life, waiting for the perfect moment to drain me completely dry. He was a coward who refused to face the consequences of his own professional failures, choosing instead to sacrifice his father on the altar of his own massive vanity. I remembered all the long, blistering, hot Texas summers I spent working double shifts on construction sites just to make sure he had a pristine college fund. I remembered the endless sacrifices Sarah had made clipping grocery coupons and sewing her own dresses so we could pay off our mortgage 5 years early. We had given him everything we possibly could, and his repayment was a forged signature designed to steal it all away. I opened my eyes and looked directly at my friend. I felt absolute clarity wash over my mind. I was a professional builder. I knew exactly how to construct a towering fortress, and I knew how to tear one down to the bare dirt. I pushed the thick stack of fraudulent loan applications completely away from me. I did not need to see any more of his pathetic, desperate lies. The rules of engagement had been clearly established by my own flesh and blood. He wanted to play a ruthless game of total financial destruction, assuming I was nothing but a weak, oblivious old man who would quietly surrender to his cruel manipulation without a fight. He had severely underestimated the man who raised him, the man who taught him how to walk. I leaned forward, resting my forearms heavily on the polished mahogany desk, and locked my unwavering gaze with Thomas. I was no longer the grieving father seeking any sort of comfort or explanation. I was a man preparing for absolute war. We are going to strike first, and we are going to strike hard. I need you to answer a very important question right now, I said, my voice steady, sharp, and entirely devoid of any remaining warmth or hesitation. How fast can we legally sell this property to a cash buyer before Wednesday? Thomas stared at me across the mahogany desk, his eyes narrowing into a sharp squint. A genuine smile spread across his weathered face. He understood exactly what I was asking, and more importantly, he understood the sheer magnitude of the retaliation I was planning. To sell real estate in less than 48 hours is usually impossible. But Austin, Texas was not a traditional market. It was a boiling cauldron of corporate development. Thomas pulled his heavy leather contact book from the corner of his desk. If you list it on the open market, it takes months, he said, his voice dropping low. But if you want to sell it today, with absolutely no contingencies and cash wired directly into a secure trust, we bypass families and go straight to the sharks. He flipped through the thick pages until he found a specific business card. He pulled it out and tapped it against the desk. Lone Star Horizon, he read aloud. They are a massive corporate real estate development firm. They have been quietly buying up huge residential lots on your side of the city to demolish old homes and build luxury condominiums. They pay entirely in cash. They buy properties strictly as is, meaning they do not care about paint, plumbing, or the roof. They only want the dirt beneath the foundation. I leaned forward, the gears in my mind turning rapidly. A corporate buyer was perfect. They did not have feelings. They did not care about family drama. They were a faceless machine that operated purely on legally binding contracts and strict deadlines. Call them, I said, my tone absolute. Tell them the property is completely off-market, but it is theirs for $1.2 million if they close the deal by tomorrow evening. Thomas picked up his phone and dialed the number. He put the call on speaker so I could hear the exchange. A smooth, professional voice answered on the second ring. Thomas introduced himself, bypassed the pleasantries, and laid the offer on the table. He provided my exact address and the asking price. I listened as the corporate representative typed rapidly on his end. Within seconds, the man confirmed that my property sat squarely inside their prime acquisition zone. The representative sounded eager. He stated that $1.2 million was easily within their immediate cash reserves. However, he cautioned that their typical expedited closing process took a minimum of 7 business days. I shook my head sharply at Thomas. I did not have 7 days. By next week, Bradley would have his forged documents filed and my assets frozen. I needed the sale finalized and the house out of my name before the sun rose on Wednesday morning. Thomas held up a finger, gesturing for me to wait. He leaned into the speakerphone, dropping his voice into a firm register. 7 days does not work for my client, Thomas told the representative. My client is offering you a prime, highly coveted corner lot. But this is a distressed timeline. You can have the property for $1.2 million cash wired into our trust account by tomorrow afternoon. But there is a very strict condition attached to this transfer. The line went silent before the representative asked him to elaborate. I leaned closer to the phone. I am the homeowner, I said, making sure my voice carried absolute authority. I will sign the deed over to your corporation tomorrow. But your company cannot take physical possession of the property, you cannot change the exterior locks, and you absolutely cannot step foot on the lawn to begin any demolition work until exactly 10 o'clock in the morning this Wednesday, not 1 minute before. The representative chuckled softly, clearly confused by the strange restriction. That is a highly unusual request, he replied. Usually sellers want to stay in the home for at least a month after closing. You are asking us to wait barely 24 hours, but restricting our access down to the exact minute. I stared blankly at the speakerphone. That is the deal, I stated coldly. You get the land you desperately want. I get the cash. But if any of your representatives show up before 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning, the deal is completely void. Do we have an agreement? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the muffled sounds of the representative consulting with the director in the background. Finally, the voice returned to the speakerphone. We have an agreement, Mr. Caldwell, the man said smoothly. We will draft the cash purchase agreement immediately and send it to your attorney. We will respect your strict timeline. Wednesday morning, exactly at 10 o'clock, Lone Star Horizon will take full legal and physical possession of the property. I thanked the man, and Thomas ended the call. The click of the receiver sounded like a gavel falling in a courtroom. The trap was officially set. The legal machinery was now in motion, and there was absolutely nothing Bradley or Megan could do to stop a multi-million-dollar corporation from claiming what was rightfully theirs. Thomas printed out a preliminary intent to sell document and slid it across the desk. I picked up his gold pen and signed my name. This time, the signature was not a sloppy forgery. It was bold, sharp, and final. I stood up from the leather chair, feeling a strange sense of weightlessness. The house was gone. The fortress I built for my family was destined to become a pile of splintered wood. But I did not feel sorrow. I felt justice. I firmly shook his hand and walked out of his office. The real challenge was just beginning. I had to go back to that house, sit across the table from the parasites trying to ruin me, and play the ultimate final acting game. I had to be the frail, forgetful old man for just a little while longer. Tuesday morning arrived with a suffocating heaviness. I sat at the kitchen island, slowly stirring plain oatmeal, while Bradley and Megan rushed around in their usual frenzy. Bradley was busy tightening his silk tie, complaining about traffic. Megan was practically vibrating with excitement, talking rapidly on her phone about a patio remodeling project she planned for the weekend. She was oblivious to the fact that by Saturday, this patio would be a pile of shattered concrete and twisted rebar. I kept my head down, forcing my hands to tremble slightly as I lifted my spoon. I played the defeated father perfectly. I agreed with their timeline, nodded at their instructions, and promised to start packing my suitcases that afternoon. By 8:30, they were out the door, leaving me alone in the quiet house. My timeline was tight. Lone Star Horizon was willing to wire the cash, but corporate policy dictated a mandatory visual inspection of the interior structure before final funding. It was a mere formality for a demolition company, just a quick walkthrough to confirm the property matched the county records. The inspector was scheduled to arrive at 1 o'clock, right in the middle of their workday. At 5 minutes to 1, a white commercial pickup truck pulled into the driveway. A tall man in a high-visibility vest and hard hat stepped out, carrying an electronic tablet. I met him at the door before he could ring the bell. He introduced himself as Marcus, the lead site assessor for Lone Star Horizon. He was strictly business, entirely uninterested in the beautiful oak floors or the custom cabinets I built for Sarah. He walked through the living room with heavy steps, tapping rapidly on his screen. As we moved into the formal dining area, Marcus paused and let out a low whistle. He stared directly at the imported Italian marble dining table and the matching velvet chairs Megan had recently purchased on credit. "That is some incredibly expensive staging furniture, Mr. Caldwell," Marcus noted, glancing around the room at the high-end electronics and designer rugs covering the floor. "I assume you have a moving company coming to clear all of this out before we take possession tomorrow morning." "Our demolition crews run on a very tight schedule. If this house is not empty, we charge a premium disposal fee." I stood next to the marble table, running my hand over the cold, unpaid stone. I looked Marcus directly in the eyes. "I have a specialized moving crew arriving early tomorrow morning to take my personal belongings," I explained calmly. "However, I want to be entirely clear with you regarding the terms of our contract. You are buying this property exactly as it stands. Whatever items I choose to take will be gone by 9:50 in the morning. But any furniture, electronics, or belongings that remain inside these walls or on this lawn at exactly 10 o'clock tomorrow morning are legally abandoned. You do not need to call me. You do not need to ask for permission. You simply treat everything left behind as construction debris. It belongs to the developer, and your bulldozers are free to crush it into the dirt." Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sheer coldness of my instructions. He had probably seen plenty of messy evictions, but a seller voluntarily sacrificing tens of thousands of dollars in luxury furniture was unheard of. He tapped his tablet a few times and nodded firmly. "Understood, sir. Whatever is left at 10 o'clock goes straight into the dumpsters." We walked upstairs so Marcus could verify the structural integrity of the roof joists in the attic. The inspection was going perfectly according to plan. I was just about to lead him back down the stairs to sign the final authorization paperwork when a sudden, terrifying sound echoed through the house. It was the loud rumble of the garage door opening. My blood turned to absolute ice. It was only 1:30 in the afternoon. Bradley and Megan never came home this early. But as I listened to the heavy thud of a car door slamming shut, I recognized the unmistakable clicking of Megan's expensive high heels on the concrete floor. She had come home for a surprise lunch break. I had less than 10 seconds before she walked through the mudroom and saw a demolition inspector standing in her hallway in a bright orange safety vest. Panic flared. I grabbed Marcus by the thick fabric of his safety vest and pulled him silently toward the back staircase that led directly down to the rear patio doors. I pressed a finger to my lips, signaling for absolute silence. Marcus looked confused, but the sheer urgency in my grip made him comply without a single word. We rushed down the wooden steps, our boots making practically no sound. I could hear the mudroom door unlocking. I shoved Marcus out the back door, stepping out onto the patio right behind him. I whispered for him to walk around the side of the house and drive away immediately. I promised I would electronically sign the final forms. Marcus gave me a quick nod and jogged toward the side gate, disappearing behind the tall fence. I pulled the heavy patio door shut behind me, my heart hammering violently. I grabbed a stray garden hose from the patio and walked back inside through the kitchen door just as Megan strolled into the room. She stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes narrowing as she looked at my boots and the hose in my hand. "What are you doing, Richard?" she demanded. I forced my breathing to slow down, adopting an expression of mild confusion. "I just had the plumber over," I lied smoothly. "The sink in the bathroom was leaking again, and I wanted to make sure it was fixed before I leave tomorrow." Megan rolled her eyes in profound annoyance, completely buying the pathetic story. The master plan had survived. The master plan had survived. The rest of Tuesday afternoon crawled by with an agonizing slowness. I retreated to my bedroom, keeping the door shut to avoid any interactions with my daughter-in-law. I spent the hours organizing the few personal items I actually cared to keep. I carefully wrapped Sarah's framed photographs in soft cotton shirts and placed them gently into my battered leather suitcase. I packed my old pocket watch, my favorite flannel shirts, and a small wooden jewelry box containing the wedding ring I had given my wife over 50 years ago. That was my entire life condensed into 2 bags. The rest of the house, the physical structure, the expensive appliances, the imported rugs meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. They were just materials to me now, entirely devoid of any real meaning. As the sun dipped below the Texas horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and charcoal, the heavy front door opened and closed. Bradley was home from work. I sat quietly in my darkened room, listening to the muffled sounds of their evening routine drifting up through the floorboards. I could hear the clinking of wine glasses and the low murmur of Bradley complaining about his boss. But it was Megan's voice that carried the most clarity. She was on a speakerphone call in the living room talking to one of her superficial friends. Her high-pitched laughter echoed through the hallway, sharp and incredibly grating. I walked silently over to my door, pressing my ear against the cool wood to listen. I could hear every single word she was saying perfectly. "I am telling you, it is going to be absolutely fabulous," Megan practically squealed into the phone. "The old man is moving out tomorrow morning. He is going to some assisted living place across town. Once he is gone, we are going to completely gut the downstairs. I am throwing a massive house remodeling party next weekend to celebrate. We are going to knock down the wall between the kitchen and the dining room to create a totally open concept space. We are bringing in caterers, and I already ordered a dozen bottles of imported champagne. It is going to be a fresh start for us. A real step up in our social circle." I stood in the dark, a silent smile spreading across my face. I shook my head in pure disbelief at her arrogant delusion. She was planning a remodeling party. She was inviting her wealthy friends over to drink champagne and smash a single wall with a sledgehammer for fun. She had no idea that a professional demolition crew of 15 men would be arriving in less than 18 hours to bring the entire structure down to the dirt. She thought she was going to repaint the kitchen cabinets. Lone Star Horizon was going to crush them into splintered kindling with a bulldozer. The sheer poetic irony of her foolish conversation was almost too delicious to bear. I pulled away from the heavy wooden door and walked back over to my small writing desk in the corner. I reached into my bag and pulled out my secure digital tablet. Thomas had provided it to me earlier that morning to ensure our communications remained completely encrypted on the home network. I pressed the power button, and the screen illuminated my face with a pale blue glow. I opened the secure email portal. Right at the top of the inbox was a message from Thomas Sterling, marked with high importance. The subject line read, "Final closing documents for immediate execution." I took a deep, steadying breath and tapped the screen to open the legal file. The document was 40 pages long, filled with corporate terminology, liability, waivers, and the absolute transfer of property rights. I read through the summary page, verifying every detail we had negotiated. The purchase price was listed clearly. $1,200,000 payable entirely in a cash wire transfer. I scrolled down to the funding section. Thomas had executed his part of the strategy flawlessly. The destination for the corporate funds was not my local checking account, which Bradley could potentially attempt to freeze or dispute using his forged legal papers. Instead, Thomas had established a private offshore trust account in my name. The money would cross international borders the moment the contract was signed, instantly vanishing into a secure financial fortress, untouchable by my son, his predatory lenders, or any local court system. Bradley wanted to steal my equity to pay off his massive credit card debts. Now he would not be able to fund a single penny, even if he hired a team of private investigators. I reached the final page of the document. A glowing yellow box indicated where my digital signature was required to execute the binding contract. I paused for just a fraction of a second. I looked around the room, taking in the crown molding I had installed, the sturdy window frames I had built, and the solid floor beneath my feet. This house had held my greatest joys and my deepest sorrows. It was the physical manifestation of my adult life. But the people downstairs had poisoned the well. They had turned my sanctuary into a prison of deceit. I placed my finger on the smooth glass of the tablet and carefully traced my signature. I hit the submit button. A green checkmark appeared on the screen, accompanied by a small chime. The tablet displayed a confirmation message stating the wire transfer had been initiated and successfully completed. The money was secured. I turned off the tablet and set it down. I looked out the window into the dark Texas night. The sale was finalized. The legal title had been transferred. I was sitting inside a building that no longer belonged to me. The property was now the legal asset of a ruthless corporate demolition company, and the countdown to destruction had officially begun. The morning sun broke through the curtains, casting a pale gray light over my bedroom. It was Wednesday, the day of the reckoning. I stood up from my bed, my joints popping in the quiet room, and walked over to the closet. Today required a very specific costume. I bypassed the clean-pressed button-down shirts and reached for a faded moth-eaten flannel and a pair of trousers that were slightly too large for my frame. I wanted to look exactly like the defeated, fading old man they so desperately needed me to be. I shuffled over to the corner of the room where my two battered leather suitcases sat. I had packed them the night before, filled only with the few precious memories I was taking with me. The heavy silence of the house was broken by the sound of upbeat music pulsing from the kitchen downstairs. They were actually playing celebratory music. I gripped the handles of my suitcases. I forced my posture to stoop, rounding my shoulders and letting my chin drop toward my chest. I practiced a long, rattling sigh before opening my bedroom door. I dragged the suitcases down the hallway, making sure the hard leather bumped loudly against the wooden stairs. Each step I took was a calculated performance. When I finally reached the bottom of the staircase, I dragged my bags into the brightly lit kitchen. Bradley and Megan were standing by the island drinking their expensive espresso. They were practically glowing with a sickening, vibrant excitement. Megan was wearing a brand new designer dress, no doubt purchased on another maxed-out credit card, and Bradley had a smug, relaxed posture I had not seen since he moved in 4 years ago. They looked like two people who had just won the lottery, completely oblivious to the fact that the winning ticket they were holding was entirely counterfeit. Megan spotted me first. She immediately put down her coffee cup and rushed over to me. Her face contorted into a mask of exaggerated, sickly sweet sympathy. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a hypocritical hug. I stood perfectly still, letting her expensive perfume wash over me, fighting every single instinct in my body that screamed at me to push her away. I could feel the absolute falseness in her embrace. It was the kind of hug you give a stray dog before dropping it off at the pound. "It is really for the best," Richard Megan cooed, stepping back and patting my arm condescendingly. "You are going to love it at Sunny Pines. You will make so many new friends there, people who can actually keep up with your pace. And do not worry about a thing here. Bradley and I are going to take wonderful care of the house. We have so many exciting plans to update the space. It will be like a brand new beginning for all of us." I looked down at the floor, forcing my hands to tremble as they rested on the handles of my suitcases. I suppressed the massive urge to laugh right in her perfectly manicured face. A brand new beginning. She had absolutely no idea how incredibly accurate that statement was about to become. In exactly 2 hours, her brand new beginning would involve a team of burly construction workers tearing out the very cabinets she was leaning against. I offered her a weak, pathetic nod, playing my role to absolute perfection. I mumbled a quiet thank you, letting my voice crack just a little bit for added dramatic effect. Bradley checked his reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator door, adjusting his silk tie with a look of pure vanity. He walked over to the kitchen island and picked up his expensive leather briefcase. He did not look sad. He did not look conflicted. He looked incredibly relieved, like he had just successfully taken out the garbage. He turned to me and clapped his hands together, a sharp sound that echoed in the large kitchen. "Well, Dad," Bradley said, glancing down at the heavy gold watch strapped to his wrist. Megan and I really gotta get to work. I have a massive morning meeting I cannot miss. The nursing home shuttle is scheduled to pick you up right at 9 o'clock, right? I kept my head bowed and offered another slow, defeated nod. Yes, I whispered softly. The shuttle will be here at 9. I will just wait right here by my bags until they arrive. Bradley smiled a wide, predatory grin that did not reach his cold eyes. Good. That is good. The facility director said the transition process is incredibly easy. Just hand them your paperwork when you get there. Oh, wait a second. He paused, reaching into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out his expensive leather wallet and flipped it open. I watched him through my lowered eyelashes, wondering what final piece of dialogue he was preparing to deliver. What he did next was so profoundly insulting, so incredibly degrading, that it instantly killed any microscopic shred of mercy that might have accidentally survived in the deepest corners of my heart. He pulled out a single crisp piece of paper currency. He walked over and casually stuffed the money into the front pocket of my faded flannel shirt, giving my chest a light, patronizing pat. Here is a little something for you to buy some nice snacks from the vending machine, he said smoothly. It was a crisp $200 bill, a pathetic payoff for stealing $1 million house. Have a good life, Dad, he added casually. Then without a single backward glance, my son and his greedy wife walked out the door, leaving me completely alone in the kitchen. I listened to the heavy garage door close. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the $200 bill, and smiled a genuine, terrifying smile. The ultimate destruction could now begin. I stood alone in the absolute silence of the kitchen, the crisp $200 bill resting lightly in the palm of my hand. I stared down at the green ink tracing the printed numbers with my thumb. $200. It was a sum of money so incredibly pathetic, so profoundly insulting, that it momentarily took my breath away. This was the final price tag Bradley had placed on my entire existence. This was his grand gesture of false generosity, after methodically plotting to steal a property worth $1,200,000. He believed that sliding a single crisp piece of currency into the faded pocket of my old flannel shirt would magically absolve him of his crushing guilt. He thought it would buy him a clear conscience while he signed the forged papers to lock me away in a state-run medical facility. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent laboring under the brutal Texas sun, pouring concrete and hammering nails specifically so he could have a life free of financial panic. I remembered handing him his very first car keys. I remembered paying his college tuition in full. Now he was offering me vending machine money to quietly disappear. I slowly folded the crisp bill in half, then in half again, and tucked it deeply into my pocket. I made a silent, unbreakable promise to myself right then and there. I would not spend a single cent of this insulting handout on myself. I was going to use this exact same bill to generously tip the foreman of my moving crew. It was the only fitting destiny for such dirty money. I turned away from the kitchen island and walked slowly toward the front of the house. I did not need to shuffle my feet anymore, but my body was still running on the lingering adrenaline of the performance. I moved into the spacious, formal living room and stood off to the side of the large bay window. I reached out and gently pulled back the edge of the heavy silk curtains Megan had recently purchased on another maxed-out credit card. I looked out through the pristine glass. The wide driveway was bathed in the bright morning sunlight. The heavy white garage door was fully open, revealing their leased silver Tesla. Bradley was already sliding into the driver's seat, adjusting his expensive tailored suit jacket so it would not wrinkle. Megan was settling into the passenger side, casually checking her makeup in the glowing vanity mirror and adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses. From the outside, anyone driving down our quiet suburban street would see the absolute picture of modern American success. A handsome, upwardly mobile couple heading off to conquer the corporate world from their massive luxury home. It was a complete and utter fabrication. The luxury car was rented. The designer clothes were unpaid. The house they were so proud to claim was legally gone. They were nothing but two incredibly desperate actors wearing expensive costumes, completely unaware that the theater they were performing in was scheduled for immediate demolition. It was a pathetic charade that was about to end very abruptly. The sleek electric vehicle hummed to life, a quiet, almost imperceptible sound compared to the loud, roaring engines of the heavy construction trucks I was used to driving. The Tesla slowly backed out of the driveway, rolling smoothly over the pristine concrete I had meticulously poured and leveled 30 years ago. I watched them closely, waiting for any sign of hesitation, guilt, or regret. I waited to see if Bradley would pause the car, look back at the beautiful house he grew up in, or perhaps cast a final glance toward the window to silently say goodbye to his father. He did none of those things. He did not tap the brakes. He did not turn his head to look back at me. He simply shifted the car into drive and pressed down on the accelerator. The silver vehicle glided down the quiet neighborhood street, passing the perfectly manicured lawns and the tall oak trees. I kept my eyes locked on the back of the car as it approached the main intersection at the end of the block. The red taillights flared briefly in the sunlight as he paused at the stop sign. Then the right turn signal flashed. The Tesla turned the corner and completely disappeared from my view, swallowed up by the morning commuter traffic. They were officially gone. The neighborhood was quiet again, completely unaware of the approaching chaos. The exact second the silver car vanished behind the distant tree line, a profound physical transformation washed over my body. The stooped, defeated posture I had carefully maintained all morning evaporated. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the familiar strength return to my spine. I lifted my chin high, breathing in a deep lungful of air. The trembling in my hands, a symptom of the helpless victim they desperately wanted me to be vanished. The frail, confused old man was dead and buried. I was Richard Caldwell again. I was the master builder, the undisputed owner of the dirt beneath my boots, and the architect of their impending ruin. I turned away from the front window and walked back to the center of the living room. I reached into my trousers and pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed my contacts and manually dialed the 10-digit number I had memorized the day before. The phone did not even complete the first full ring before a deep, rough voice answered on the other end. It was the dispatch manager for the heavy logistics company Thomas had recommended. I did not offer a greeting. I did not waste a single second on polite morning conversation. The time for acting was over, and the time for destruction had arrived. I looked around the lavish, over-decorated room one last time, my voice steady and cold as ice. "Bring the trucks." I ended the call and slipped the phone into my pocket. The silence in the house was absolute, a temporary peace. I stood by the front window watching the clock tick forward. At exactly 8:30, the quiet street was awakened by the throaty rumble of heavy diesel engines. I watched through the glass as 3 massive moving trucks turned onto my street, rolling in a tight convoy. Their air brakes hissed as they parked in a perfect line, blocking the property. The heavy metal doors swung open, and a crew of 15 burly men wearing thick work boots and gray uniforms stepped out. They moved with the sharp efficiency of a military unit, preparing for a rapid extraction. The crew foreman, a massive man with a thick beard and a clipboard tucked under his arm, walked up my driveway. I opened the front door before he reached the steps. I did not bother with small talk. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the crisp $200 bill Bradley had patronizingly stuffed there 30 minutes ago, and slapped it onto the clipboard. The man looked at the money, then up at me with a surprised expression. "That is just the tip for getting your men moving twice as fast," I told him, my voice carrying the authority of a veteran contractor. "I have a strict deadline today, and I need this extraction executed flawlessly." The foreman pocketed the money with a firm nod, turning to his crew to whistle sharply. The men swarmed the lawn carrying heavy-duty dollies, thick moving blankets, and massive rolls of packing tape. I stood in the grand entryway and raised my hand, calling for their attention. The 15 men stopped and looked at me, waiting for orders. "Listen to me very carefully," I instructed, making sure my voice echoed clearly through the living room. "You are not clearing this entire house. You are only taking the specific items I point out to you. If I do not explicitly tell you to pack it, you do not touch it. You do not look at it. You leave it exactly where it sits." I walked them through the house, pointing out the genuine pieces of my life. I directed a team to the dining room, instructing them to carefully wrap and box the antique rosewood hutch that belonged to my late wife. I watched as they securely packed Sarah's delicate porcelain china, treating each piece with absolute respect. I sent another team down to the basement and out to the garage, ordering them to load up every piece of heavy machinery, power tool, and hand wrench I owned. Those tools had built this house, and they were leaving with me. I had them pack my heavy oak desk from the study, ignoring the chaotic pile of papers Bradley had scattered across the floor. The men worked with breathtaking speed. I walked from room to room, watching my 40 years of history being systematically boxed up and carried out the front door. As my genuine belongings disappeared into the bellies of the massive moving trucks, the absolute absurdity of Bradley and Megan's fake life was left on full display. I explicitly told the movers to walk right past Megan's imported Italian marble dining table. I told them to ignore the massive 85-inch television mounted in the living room and to leave the $8,000 velvet sectional sofa sitting exactly where it was. When the movers went upstairs, they walked right past Bradley's master suite, leaving their designer clothes, expensive electronics, and overflowing jewelry boxes completely untouched. One of the younger movers paused in the living room, looking confused as he stood next to a towering, incredibly expensive abstract sculpture Megan had recently placed by the staircase. "Do you want us to wrap this statue, sir?" the young man asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. I looked at the hideous piece of art, knowing she had put it on a high-interest credit card just last month. I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied, my tone flat and uncompromising. "Leave the statue. Leave the velvet couches. Leave the marble table. That is not my property. That is nothing but garbage waiting for the dump." The young mover shrugged and went back to carrying my solid oak bookcases. By 9:15, the house felt entirely different. The soul of the home, the items that held actual weight and memory, were completely gone. What remained was a hollow, echoing shell filled with expensive props for a stage play that had just been permanently canceled. The foreman approached me in the empty hallway, wiping his hands on his uniform trousers. He handed me the clipboard to sign off on the loaded inventory. "We have everything you requested, Mr. Caldwell," he reported professionally. "The trucks are fully loaded and ready to head to the secure storage facility you rented." I signed the final pass of paperwork and thanked him sincerely. As the 15 men filed out the front door and climbed back into their massive trucks, I knew my morning was still far from over. I stood in the middle of the gutted living room, surrounded by Megan's unpaid luxury furniture. The digital clock was ticking closer to 10 o'clock. The demolition crew from Lone Star Horizon would be arriving soon, and they would gladly crush all of this expensive furniture into dust. But I had a much better vindictive plan for their prized possessions. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone for the second time that morning. Thomas had not just investigated their massive credit card debt. He had also provided me with the direct contact information for the aggressive collection agencies hunting them down. I scrolled through my contact list, found the specific number for the asset recovery firm handling Megan's primary accounts, and pressed the call button. The absolute destruction of their fake empire was about to get incredibly personal. I pressed the call button and waited as the line connected. A woman with a sharp, professional voice answered immediately. I identified myself as Richard Caldwell, the legal owner of the property where Megan Caldwell resided. I informed the recovery agent that the debtor was not on the premises, but I was standing in the living room looking directly at tens of thousands of dollars of unpaid merchandise. I told her that I was permanently vacating the property in less than an hour. and if her team wanted to secure their assets before the building was legally transferred to a corporate developer and demolished, they needed to arrive immediately. The woman on the phone did not hesitate. She verified the address and told me she had 2 trucks operating just a few miles away. She dispatched them on an emergency priority order. I ended the call and walked over to the kitchen island, pouring myself a glass of tap water. I leaned against the counter, watching the digital clock on the oven tick forward. At exactly 9:15, the quiet suburban street was disrupted once again. This time it was not the clean crews of a moving company. 2 rugged flatbed trucks and a large unmarked cargo van pulled aggressively into my driveway, their tires crunching loudly against the concrete. Several men in heavy canvas work jackets jumped out, carrying heavy-duty straps, power drills, and moving blankets. They looked tough, efficient, and completely devoid of patience. The lead agent, a stocky man holding a thick binder full of collection notices and asset manifests, marched directly up to my front door. I opened it wide to greet him. He asked for Richard Caldwell, and I handed him my state identification card to prove my ownership of the property. He reviewed my credentials and then showed me the itemized list of Megan's outstanding debts. It was a staggering catalog of absolute vanity. I stepped aside and made a sweeping gesture with my arm, inviting the recovery team into the house. I told the lead agent that as the sole legal homeowner, I was granting them full, unrestricted access to repossess every single item on their manifest. I warned him that they had exactly 35 minutes to clear the house before the property was legally handed over to a demolition crew. The man's eyes widened slightly at the mention of demolition, and he immediately barked orders to his team. The repo men flooded into the living room like a swarm of angry locusts. There was no gentle wrapping of porcelain or careful boxing of antiques this time. This was a swift, calculated, and brutal extraction of unpaid assets. They operated with ruthless speed, tearing through the rooms and grabbing everything of value that my daughter-in-law had fraudulently acquired to impress her fake friends. I stood by the front window sipping my water and watched the systematic dismantling of my daughter-in-law's fake high society life. 2 men grabbed the expensive $8,000 velvet sectional sofa. They did not bother covering it with protective blankets. They tipped it on its side, maneuvered it through the front doorway, and dragged it out to the cargo van. Another team marched directly toward the 85-inch flat-screen television mounted on the living room wall. Megan had constantly bragged to her friends about that television, claiming Bradley had bought it for her as a surprise anniversary gift. In reality, it was heavily financed at a predatory interest rate she had not paid in 4 months. The men used power drills to strip the mounting brackets from the drywall, leaving holes behind. They carried the black screen out without a second thought. Next came the formal dining room. The Italian marble table, the centerpiece of all those dinner parties where I was banished to my bedroom, was dismantled in minutes. The men unscrewed the heavy stone top from the brass legs, loaded the pieces onto a reinforced dolly, and wheeled the dining set out the front door. They took the matching velvet chairs. They took the abstract sculpture from the hallway. They even went upstairs into the master suite and repossessed the custom mattress and the expensive mahogany bedroom suite she had bragged about. I watched them strip away every single layer of her fabricated wealth, exposing the hollow, rotting core of their financial reality. They were not just taking furniture. They were ripping away the mask she wore to hide her insecurities. By 9:45, the recovery team had loaded the last of the unpaid assets onto their trucks. The lead agent handed me a receipt acknowledging the retrieval of the property, gave me a brief nod of thanks, and ordered his men to roll out. I watched the trucks back out of my driveway, their cargo beds packed tight with the remnants of Bradley and Megan's ruined lifestyle. As the sound of their engines faded away down the street, a silence fell over the house. I turned around and looked at the interior. It was barren. The walls were bare, the floors were empty, and the space felt massive. Without the expensive rugs, the velvet couches, and the designer decorations, it was just an empty box made of wood and drywall. I slowly walked through the gutted living room. My work boots thudded against the oak floorboards. The sound echoed off the bare walls, a rhythmic testament to my victory. I had dismantled their world. I walked into the kitchen, placing my glass on the granite counter. The house was dead. It was no longer a home. It was just an empty shell waiting for the final blow. The digital clock on the oven shifted to 9:50. The deadline was approaching. I walked toward the front door and looked out the bay window. A black corporate SUV was turning onto my street, followed closely by a pickup truck pulling a flatbed trailer. The new owners were arriving. The black corporate utility vehicle pulled smoothly into the empty space at the end of the driveway, its heavy tires crunching over the loose gravel. Right behind it, a heavy-duty pickup truck hauling a large flatbed trailer came to a complete stop. I looked down at my wristwatch. The digital display flipped to exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. The deadline had arrived with perfect punctuality. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, feeling the warm Texas sun hit my face. 4 men wearing bright orange safety vests and thick yellow hard hats stepped out of the vehicles. The man leading the group was Marcus, the site assessor, who had briefly toured the house the day before. He was holding a thick plastic clipboard and bolt cutters. Marcus walked up the concrete pathway, his heavy boots echoing in the quiet suburban morning. He stopped at the base of the porch stairs and looked up at me with a professional, entirely detached expression. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying easily over the low rumble of the idling truck engine. "It is exactly 10 o'clock. Lone Star Horizon is officially ready to take full physical and legal possession of the property as outlined in our executed contract. Is the structure completely cleared of your personal property?" I reached into the pocket of my faded flannel shirt and pulled out the heavy brass keyring. It held the keys to the front door, the deadbolt on my study, the back patio, and the heavy garage door. These small pieces of cut metal had represented my ultimate authority over this sanctuary for 4 long decades. I looked at them for a fraction of a second, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of relief. I walked down the 3 wooden steps and dropped the heavy ring directly into his waiting palm. The metal clinked sharply against his calloused skin. "The house is completely yours," I replied evenly. "Everything I care about is gone." Marcus nodded and immediately turned to his waiting crew. He raised his hand and blew a short, sharp whistle. The 3 men sprang into action like a coiled spring suddenly released. They jogged to the back of the pickup truck and began unloading heavy sledgehammers, massive pry bars, and thick industrial power drills. The peaceful, quiet illusion of my former suburban life was instantly shattered by the loud, aggressive sounds of systematic destruction. One of the men marched straight up to the porch, completely ignoring me, and pressed a heavy power drill against the hinges of the solid oak front door. The loud screech of grinding metal filled the air as he rapidly stripped the thick screws from the wood. I stood on the walkway and watched as another worker walked over to the pristine white picket fence bordering the front lawn. Sarah had always wanted a white picket fence. I had built it for her 30 years ago, painting it fresh every single spring. The worker swung a massive steel sledgehammer in a wide, brutal arc. The heavy metal head smashed into the wooden post with a sickening crack. The wood splintered violently, and a large section of the beautiful fence instantly collapsed into the green grass. They were not just taking the house apart. They were erasing its entire history. Within 5 short minutes, the heavy front door was completely removed and tossed carelessly onto the flatbed trailer. Another man was already unscrewing the large glass panels of the living room windows, exposing the hollow interior of the house to the outside air. The property was no longer a residential home. Legally and physically, it was now an active, hazardous demolition site. Yellow caution tape was being aggressively unrolled and tied around the remaining fence posts and the large oak tree in the front yard. Marcus walked past me and stepped through the empty front doorway, entering the completely gutted living room. I followed slowly behind him, my boots crunching on small fragments of shattered glass and splintered wood that now littered the entryway. Marcus stopped in the center of the massive room, resting his hands on his hips. The repo men had taken all the expensive furniture, leaving the room almost entirely bare. However, piled haphazardly in the very center of the floor was a pathetic, chaotic mound of leftover personal belongings. Bradley and Megan had not packed a single box before leaving for work. Their expensive designer clothes, cheap imported electronics, countless pairs of high-heeled shoes, and ridiculous decorative knickknacks were heaped in a massive pile. They were the items the repo men legally could not take. Marcus pointed his pen at the massive pile of clothes and electronics. "What do you want us to do with all of this stuff?" he asked, looking over his shoulder at me. "Our contract states that anything left inside is considered abandoned debris. Do you want my men to throw it straight into the industrial dumpsters out back?" I stared at the pile of tailored suits and colorful dresses. Throwing it away cleanly would hide their absolute ruin from the neighborhood. I shook my head slowly. "Do not throw it in the dumpster," I instructed, pointing a steady finger toward the open doorless entryway. "I want you to drag that junk out to the front lawn. Leave it right there in the dirt, completely exposed to the open street. It is not my property, and I do not care what happens to it." Marcus shrugged his shoulders. "You heard the man," he shouted. "Bag that garbage up and drag it outside." The workers immediately pulled thick black industrial trash bags from their belts. They began roughly shoving handfuls of expensive silk ties, designer dresses, and tangled cords into the plastic. They hauled the black bags outside and dumped them onto the front lawn. I walked out to my waiting hired town car, got inside, and drove away from the demolition site. The plush leather seats of the hired town car embraced me as we glided smoothly away from the neighborhood. I did not look back out the rear window. There was absolutely nothing left for me to see on that street. The house I had painstakingly built with my own hands was already undergoing a violent transformation, returning to the raw dirt it had once been. I stared straight ahead, watching the familiar suburban streets gradually give way to the towering glass and steel structures of downtown Austin. The midday traffic was a chaotic river of movement, but inside the insulated cabin of the car, I sat in perfect, undisturbed silence. The heavy burden of betrayal that had been crushing my chest for days was finally lifting, replaced by a deep, resonant sense of vindication. I directed the driver to a specific address right in the heart of the city. It was an iconic luxury hotel, the kind of establishment where wealthy corporate executives and visiting dignitaries stayed. Bradley and Megan had always talked about wanting to spend a weekend there, but their maxed-out credit cards could never cover the exorbitant deposit. I, on the other hand, had a fresh offshore trust account holding $1.2 million. I stepped out of the vehicle, handed the driver a generous tip, and handed my 2 battered leather suitcases to a waiting bellhop in a crisp uniform. The lobby was a masterpiece of polished marble crystal chandeliers and soft classical music. I walked directly to the concierge desk and secured their premium penthouse suite, paying the $1,000 nightly rate up front without a single flinch. It was a steep price, but I considered it a minor investment in my own peace of mind. The bellhop escorted me to the top floor, unlocking the heavy double doors to reveal a massive sunlit living space. The suite featured floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the entire Austin skyline. The furnishings were exquisite, crafted from rich mahogany and soft, genuine leather. It was a level of absolute luxury that dwarfed the pathetic financed illusion my son had tried to build. I tipped the bellhop with the very last piece of cash in my wallet, locked the heavy suite door, and walked over to the elegant wet bar situated in the corner of the room. I reached for a heavy crystal decanter filled with aged premium bourbon. I poured a generous measure into a thick glass, the amber liquid catching the afternoon sunlight. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The liquor burned a warm, satisfying path down my throat, settling my remaining nerves. I carried the glass over to the massive oak desk, positioned right in front of the skyline window. I set the bourbon down, unzipped my small leather travel bag, and pulled out my laptop. I opened the laptop and waited for the screen to boot up. While my son and his greedy wife believed I was a confused, technologically illiterate old man, they had severely underestimated my meticulous nature. Late Monday night, while they were fast asleep, dreaming about their future renovations, I had quietly slipped out the front door, wearing dark clothing. I carried a tall ladder and a small battery-powered high-definition 4,000-pixel security camera. I walked across the quiet street and climbed the massive ancient oak tree that stood directly opposite my property. I had spent nearly an hour carefully mounting the small device high up in the thick branches, completely hidden by the dense summer foliage. I angled the lens to provide a perfect, unobstructed wide-angle view of the entire front yard, the driveway, and the main entrance of the house. I had disguised the camera housing with brown tape to blend seamlessly with the tree bark. Now sitting comfortably in my air-conditioned penthouse suite miles away, I clicked on the secure application icon on my desktop. The software loaded quickly, connecting to the wireless cellular signal of the hidden camera. A loading circle spun briefly in the center of the screen before the live video feed suddenly flared to life in brilliant razor-sharp clarity. I leaned back in my plush leather chair, resting my hands on the desk, and watched the magnificent spectacle of consequences unfolding in real time. The camera angle was perfect. I could see the pile of black trash bags containing Megan and Bradley and their expensive designer clothes sitting pathetically in the dirt of the front lawn. Behind the bags, the demolition crew was working with breathtaking efficiency. A massive yellow excavator had arrived on the site. Its heavy metal treads chewed through the beautiful green grass I had watered every single morning. The large mechanical arm reached up to the roof of the house. I watched through the high-definition feed as the steel bucket scraped violently against the shingles, ripping them away in massive dusty chunks. The wooden roof trusses splintered and collapsed inward, sending a thick cloud of gray debris into the bright blue sky. The house was systematically being devoured, reduced from $1 million luxury home into a chaotic pile of industrial waste. Time seemed to blur as I sat there captivated by the absolute finality of the destruction. Hours passed. The bright afternoon sun slowly began to dip lower into the western sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the ruined property. The digital clock in the corner of my laptop screen blinked steadily. The numbers shifted to 5:15, then 5:20, marching inevitably forward. The demolition crew began packing up their heavy tools for the day, leaving the gutted, roofless shell of the house standing naked and destroyed in the fading light. The sun began to set, painting the sky in deep shades of crimson and burnt orange. 5:30 approached. The trap was about to spring. I reached out, picked up my crystal glass, and took a slow, satisfying sip of my premium bourbon. The amber liquid burned smoothly down my throat, a warm and comforting contrast to the cold, calculated reality playing out on my laptop screen. The digital clock in the corner of the display shifted to exactly 5:45 in the evening. The long shadows of the Texas sunset stretched across the ruined, chaotic landscape of what used to be my pristine front lawn. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, my eyes locked on the live, high-definition video feed, broadcasting from the hidden camera nestled high in the branches of the ancient oak tree. The quiet suburban street was perfectly still for a few long moments. Then the sleek silver nose of his leased Tesla glided into the frame. The vehicle rolled smoothly down the asphalt, completely out of place against the backdrop of industrial destruction. I watched as the car slowed down, the red brake lights flaring brightly as it approached the property line. The vehicle came to a sudden, jerky halt right in the middle of the street. From my vantage point in the penthouse suite, I could vividly imagine the absolute confusion washing over my son inside that luxurious cabin. He had expected to pull into a smooth, freshly poured concrete driveway. Instead, he was staring at a violently churned path of raw dirt, deep tire ruts, and shattered chunks of gray stone. The heavy excavators had completely destroyed the approach to the property hours ago. The silver car idled in the street for a long, agonizing minute. Finally, the driver's side door popped open. Bradley stepped out onto the pavement, still wearing his expensive, tailored corporate suit. He left the car door hanging wide open, standing perfectly still in the street, as his brain desperately tried to process the impossible scene in front of him. The massive white picket fence was gone. The carefully manicured green grass was buried under layers of brown dust and broken lumber. A few seconds later, the passenger door opened. Megan stepped out into the fading evening light, her oversized designer sunglasses pushed up onto the top of her head. She was holding a vibrant, incredibly expensive leather handbag she had undoubtedly purchased using one of her hidden credit accounts. She took 2 steps toward the property line and stopped dead in her tracks. Even through the silent video feed, the sheer magnitude of her shock was palpable. Her shoulders slumped entirely, and her hands went completely limp. The vibrant leather handbag slipped from her fingers, plummeting to the ground and landing with a heavy thud in a pile of raw, dusty dirt. She did not even attempt to pick it up. She just stood there, staring blankly at the hollowed-out, roofless shell of the building she had arrogantly planned to remodel and show off to her superficial friends by next weekend. The beautiful bay windows where I had stood just that morning were entirely gone, leaving massive, jagged rectangular holes in the exterior walls. The heavy, solid oak front door had been completely removed from its hinges, exposing the dark, gutted interior of the house to the open evening air. Bradley finally broke from his paralyzed stance. Panic took over his movements. He broke into a frantic, uncoordinated sprint, his expensive leather dress shoes slipping and sliding across the treacherous, uneven dirt path where the driveway used to be. He charged up the remaining concrete steps of the front porch, completely ignoring the bright yellow caution tape flapping violently in the evening breeze. He burst through the empty doorway and disappeared into the dark, hollow belly of the ruined house. I watched the screen intently, taking another slow sip of my bourbon. The interior of the house was not completely abandoned. Lone Star Horizon had left a small night crew behind to secure the active demolition zone and prepare the site for the heavy wrecking balls scheduled to arrive the following morning. I knew exactly what Bradley was encountering inside those bare, echoing walls. He was running through empty rooms, finding no velvet couches, no marble dining tables, and no massive flat-screen televisions. He was finding nothing but exposed wiring, torn drywall, and bare wooden studs. Less than 2 minutes after he sprinted inside the front doorway was suddenly filled with rapid movement. Bradley came stumbling backward out onto the porch, his hands raised defensively in front of his chest. Towering over him was the massive, bearded construction foreman who had been directing the demolition crew all afternoon. The foreman was wearing a bright orange high-visibility vest and holding a heavy steel clipboard. Even without audio, the body language was incredibly clear and completely one-sided. The foreman was aggressively pointing a thick finger directly at his chest, taking dominant, forceful steps forward and physically backing my son down the porch stairs. Bradley was gesturing wildly, pointing back at the empty house and likely screaming about his rights, his property, and his impending renovation plans. The foreman did not care about his tailored suit or his frantic, desperate yelling. He simply pointed his heavy steel clipboard toward a massive white metal sign that had been bolted to a sturdy wooden post near the street. The sign was printed with bold, impossible-to-miss red lettering. It clearly stated that the entire property was an active, restricted construction zone, exclusively owned by the Lone Star Horizon Corporate Development Group. It also stated that any unauthorized trespassers would be immediately prosecuted by local law enforcement. Bradley stopped gesturing entirely. His arms fell limply to his sides as the reality of the massive corporate warning sign finally penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. The foreman gave him one final shove toward the dirt path and turned his back, walking inside the gutted house. Bradley stumbled. He slowly turned his head, scanning the ruined landscape. That was when he noticed his clothes stuffed into black trash bags on the lawn, with a single piece of paper taped to the plastic. Bradley stood completely frozen in the dirt, staring at the black plastic trash bags piled on the ruined lawn. Through the camera feed, I watched his hands tremble as he peeled the paper taped to the plastic. It was a formal eviction notice from Lone Star Horizon. Before he could even finish reading the typed words, the sleek black smartphone sitting on my mahogany desk began to vibrate violently. The caller identification displayed Bradley's name. I let it ring 3 times, allowing his panic to marinate. On the fourth ring, I answered the call and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the chaotic, breathless sounds of absolute terror radiating from the other end of the line. Dad. "Where are you?" Bradley screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with a high-pitched hysteria. "Oh my God. Dad, you have to call the police right now. We have been robbed. The house is completely destroyed. They took the doors, they took the windows, they took all of our furniture. There is a crazy construction crew here claiming they own the land. Where are you? Are you safe?" He was hyperventilating, consumed by the collapse of his reality. I took a slow breath, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Austin skyline. "I am perfectly safe, Bradley," I replied, my voice as smooth and cold as a sheet of winter ice. "And you have not been robbed. A robbery implies that someone took something that actually belonged to you." A confused silence followed, broken only by Megan sobbing in the background. "What are you talking about?" Bradley stammered, the panic in his voice giving way to a sickening dread. "The house is gutted. Everything is gone." I took another sip from my crystal glass, savoring the absolute control I possessed over this moment. "You told me it was time for me to move out, Bradley. You sat at my kitchen island and told me I was no longer safe in the house I built. You wanted me out, so I moved out. Since my name is the only one on the deed, I decided I did not need the house either. I sold it this morning to a corporate developer. The men standing on the porch are not robbers. They are the legal owners. You are trespassing on an active commercial demolition site." "You sold the house," Bradley shrieked, his voice echoing loudly over the phone. "You cannot do that. We live here. We have tenant rights. We have hundreds of thousands of dollars of luxury furniture in there. I am calling a lawyer." I let out a low, humorless chuckle. "You cannot call a lawyer, Bradley, because you cannot afford one. And you certainly do not have any furniture. Did you really think I was blind to your massive financial ruin? Did you think I would not find out about your massive credit card debt? The people who took your velvet couches and your marble table were not thieves. They were asset recovery agents. I let the repo men inside myself. I gave them full permission to strip the house bare before the demolition crew arrived. They took everything you bought with money you did not have." "Dad, please," Bradley begged, his arrogance completely shattered, replaced by the pathetic whining of a desperate child. "You cannot do this to us. I am your son. Where are we supposed to go? We have no money. We have nothing left. You have to fix this. Stop the demolition. Tell them it was a mistake." I leaned forward in my leather chair. "You stopped being my son the exact second you decided to treat me like a disposable obstacle," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "Did you really believe I would not check the lock on my own study? Did you honestly think I would not find the fraudulent power of attorney you hid in my desk?" The line went completely dead. For a long, terrifying moment, Bradley stopped breathing. I could hear the sheer, paralyzing horror washing over him. "That is right, Bradley. I found the forged signature. I found the fake notary stamp. I read the emails between you and Apex Horizon Financial. You were going to lock me in a state facility and steal the equity of my home to fund your pathetic vanity. You tried to legally erase my existence, but you forgot who raised you. While you were busy packing my bags for the nursing home this morning, Thomas Sterling was walking into the district attorney's office. He handed them the forged documents, the emails, and the financial records an hour ago. You are not just homeless, Bradley. You are actively looking at multiple charges of felony fraud and elder abuse. The police are likely drafting the arrest warrants right now." "Dad, I am so sorry." Bradley sobbed violently. "I was desperate. I did not mean it. Please stop them. I am begging you." I looked at the $200 bill on my desk. I felt no pity. "I have nothing left to say to you," I told him. "Use that $200 bill to rent a cheap motel room for the night. You will need a place to sleep before the police arrive. Goodbye, Bradley. I pulled the phone away from my ear before he could scream another desperate plea and pressed the red button to end the call. I immediately opened my settings, selected his contact profile, and permanently blocked his number. I blocked Megan's number as well. I set the phone face down on the polished mahogany desk. I turned my attention back to the laptop screen. Through the hidden camera, I watched my son collapse onto his knees in the dry dirt, completely burying his face in his hands, while his absolutely furious wife screamed at him in the fading Texas twilight. It was finally completely over. 3 months have passed since that warm evening in downtown Austin. Today, the Texas heat is nothing more than a distant memory, completely replaced by the gentle rolling breeze of the Italian countryside. I am currently sitting on a stone balcony overlooking a sprawling, sunlit vineyard in Tuscany. A glass of deep red wine rests on the wrought iron table beside me, and the fragrant scent of roasted garlic and fresh basil drifts up from the small kitchen inside my rented villa. I take a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound sense of peace settle into my bones. The heavy, suffocating weight of betrayal that had anchored me to the ground for so long has entirely vanished. I am finally free, but the path to this freedom required a surgical, ruthless severing of the toxic ties that bound me. The aftermath of that Wednesday evening was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. I did not stay in the United States to watch the dust settle. Thomas handled all of the legal communications, while I quietly packed my bags and boarded a first-class flight across the Atlantic Ocean. But Thomas kept me meticulously updated on every single detail of their spectacular downfall. Bradley did not even make it through the weekend before the consequences of his arrogance completely caught up with him. Later that same night, after I hung up the phone and blocked his number forever, he and Megan were forced to take a taxi to a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. They used the crisp $200 bill I had given him that morning to pay for a cheap, filthy room. But they did not stay there long. Early Thursday morning, 2 marked police cruisers pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of that motel. The district attorney did not waste any time after reviewing the forged power of attorney and the emails detailing their scheme to defraud me of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Bradley was arrested right there in the parking lot. He was marched out of his cheap motel room, wearing the exact same wrinkled tailored suit he had worn the day before. He was placed in the back of a police cruiser, wearing heavy steel handcuffs. The charges were severe: felony forgery, attempted grand larceny, and elder abuse. When the news of his highly public arrest reached the corporate firm where he worked, the reaction was immediate and unforgiving. A financial management company cannot employ a man facing federal fraud charges. Bradley was terminated from his position, effectively immediately losing his salary, his benefits, and whatever tiny shred of professional reputation he still possessed. But the absolute ultimate blow came from the very woman he had destroyed his own father to please. Megan did not stand by her husband during his darkest hour. The exact second she realized that the luxurious lifestyle was permanently over, that the $1 million house was a pile of rubble, and that the endless stream of invisible credit had instantly dried up in her marriage vows, completely evaporated into thin air. She filed for a contested divorce less than 3 weeks after his arrest, desperately trying to distance herself from his criminal charges and the mounting mountain of unpaid debt. Even the leased silver Tesla, the ultimate symbol of their fake wealth, was towed away by a repossession company directly from the impound lot. They were left with absolutely nothing but those black plastic trash bags sitting in the dirt. Sitting here on this beautiful balcony, watching the Italian sun slowly dip below the green hills, I often find myself reflecting on the harsh concept of tough love. People might look at my actions and call me a cold, vindictive father. They might say that family should always forgive family no matter how deep the knife is pushed into your back. But those people have never looked into the eyes of their own child and seen nothing but a greedy, calculating parasite staring back at them. I did grieve for my son. I mourned the loss of the boy I taught to balance a checkbook, but I realized that I had actually lost him decades ago. The man who forged my signature and planned to lock me in a sterile facility to steal my hard-earned legacy was a stranger. You cannot save someone who is perfectly willing to drown you just so they can stand on your shoulders. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a deeply flawed person is to allow them to face the absolute unfiltered consequences of their own actions. I refused to be his final victim. I chose to survive. Now I am living the exact life my beautiful Sarah and I always dreamed about when we were young and struggling to make ends meet. We always talked about traveling through Europe, drinking fine wine, and exploring ancient cities. We delayed those dreams to build a stable foundation for our family. Now I am finally honoring her memory by living every single day to the absolute fullest. I am using the wealth we built together to see the world free from the heavy burdens of ungrateful children and toxic obligations. Some people might say I was too cruel to my own flesh and blood. They might argue that my retaliation was too severe. But respect is a currency that must be earned, and brutal betrayal must always be paid in full. I drew a hard boundary, and I enforced it with the only language they truly understood. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have allowed them to lock you away, or would you have torn the house down around them? Please let me know your honest thoughts about this situation in the comments down below. Make sure to hit the subscribe button if you strongly believe in standing up for yourself. Thank you for watching, and remember, never let anyone steal your dignity.